In this lesson, let's write the logic that will handle our form submissions. Let's open up our task controller and get started. The first thing we want to do is change this method to handle both creating new entries and editing existing tasks. The logic for this is really simple, so I'm going to paste over this entire method. The signature of our action method now accepts a parameter called ID, which defaults to 0. This means that if the requesting URL doesn't include an ID parameter for a task to edit, we assume the user is creating a new task, so we can default that parameter to 0 and use it as a check. Inside the method, we are creating a new instance of our data access context class and retrieving a list of categories with it. In a real app, you'll want to create instances like this context class in the controller's constructor via dependency injection, but this simpler way will work for right now. These categories are then assigned to the view bag, which is a dynamic helper class that allows you to pass miscellaneous data to views outside of just their associated model. Generally, you should avoid this practice, but it's useful in some scenarios, so I want you to be aware of it. So if the ID is equal to 0, we can just return the empty form like always. If the ID does have a value, we can pull that entry out of the database. We can then pass that entry into our view, which will populate the form elements with the right values using our razor helpers. So retrieving our form like this is simple enough. Now let's handle the actual form submission. I'm going to paste in another method below the first one, and note that we have this HTTP post attribute attached to the method. This means that MVC will only select this method to handle post requests, or in other words, when the form is submitted. As the name implies, action methods allow us to have an isolated method for each user action, which makes it nice to work with. We are also passing a task object into this method as a parameter. This is really the heart of this lesson and how MVC handles form data. Like we discussed in the slides, the model binder will retrieve the posted form values from the HTTP request and bind them to the matching properties on this object. Inside of our method, we have this conditional check to see whether the model state is valid. We're going to look at model state more closely in the next module. For now, just know that this is checking whether or not valid data was applied during model binding. If it was successful and valid, we want to persist either the updated or a new task instance to the database. We're then redirecting to the View All Tasks page so the admin will be able to see their new task in the list. If the data was not valid, we want to return the form view and pass in our model object. As we'll discuss in the next module, Razor can handle displaying error messages in the model state for everything that went wrong if we just reload the form with this data. If we aren't going to redirect, we also want to make sure to repopulate the categories for our drop-down list, or else we'll get an error. One last thing we need to do is quick jump over to our Create Edit view. We need to update our category drop-down control to use the list of categories we placed in the view bag. So where we're currently passing in this list variable, let's change that to viewbag.categories, and then in front of it, we'll cast it as a list of type select list item since the view bag is dynamic and won't have a specific type declared. We can then delete the razor variable out from above. Let's jump back over to our controller and place a breakpoint inside of the post method, and then let's run our application and see what this gives us in action. After the site loads, just head on over to the Create Task page again. Inside of here, we want to fill out some quick sample data for this form so that we can submit it. So I'll just enter in a title and a description. It doesn't really matter what you put in here, just make sure that the data is properly formatted since we don't have our validation in place yet. And for the assigned to and associated message fields, just type in 1, which are the IDs for some of our sample data. We'll look at how to auto-suggest meaningful values from the database in a later module. Once you have all these in place, go ahead and submit the form. Immediately we'll hit the breakpoint that we set in our action method. If we mouse over our task parameter and expand it, we'll see that the values we want to bind have been populated with our form values just like we'd expect. The null values we see listed in here are just the Entity Framework navigation properties, so we would not expect those to have a value right now during binding. While we still have our debugger running, let's open up our watch window to look at something interesting. Let's type request.form as a watch variable, and let's see what this gives us. You can see all of our posted form values listed out here, and they're labeled with names identical to the properties of our task class. The model binder is able to figure out what values should be assigned using this information. One other thing I want to do is place a breakpoint inside of our create edit get method, and then let's just hit continue in our debugger. And since our model state was valid, we'll be directed to the View All pages for our tasks. The data on this page is still static, so we can't see ours in the list. However, I can return to the task we just created by manually typing in the URL for it in the address bar. So I'll go up to the top of our browser and just type in localhost/task/create-edit, and then also add in the ID of our newly created task. You can either check the database for this ID or just guess and check since we only have a few tasks listed here and they're ordered sequentially. I'll just add that at the end and let's hit enter. You'll see that we hit the breakpoint in our create edit get method. More interestingly, if we mouse over this ID parameter, you'll see that it's set to 4. This means that if we step through the method, we should land inside of our else block, which will extract our task out of the database. If I hit continue again, we'll land back in our application and our form will be pre-populated with the item we just created. We could now resubmit this form to edit our existing task or click the link over to the left to create a brand new one again. As you can see, we're well on our way to finishing this form, but we still need to address a major issue. Right now, if I fill out this form with bad data, we will not get helpful error messages and checks to make sure everything is valid. Model validation is an enjoyable and useful topic, so let's explore that in depth in the next module.